devastating consequences of the acceptance of the theory of evolution, but it's simply scientific fact, and we're stuck with it. At least, so we're told. Well, actually, not quite so fast. Let's take a closer look.
I think on the surface, you can build a scientific case for Darwinism. In reality, though, the more you examine it, the more its pillars rot under scrutiny.
The so-called fact of evolution is not a fact at all. It, too, is a hypothesis still looking for evidence.
The missing links to me are missing everywhere.
No evidence will ever be accepted to disprove Darwinism because they must believe in Darwinism.
Darwin wrote a book
in the public school classroom, in the mainstream media, and in natural history museums, Darwinism is pushed everywhere, even to dogmatic degrees. Darwin theorized that all life could have originated from a common one-celled ancestor over long periods of time, and that natural selection retained the random changes that were most helpful to the organism's survival. And this was the origin of all of life in all of its variety. But how accurate is the theory on closer examination?
Now, in science, we scientists propose theories. Some are true and some are false.
Dr. Jonathan Wells has earned 2 PhDs, one at Yale and one at Berkeley, in science. He is the author of the groundbreaking book, Icons of Evolution.
Darwin proposed a good theory, which I think has turned out to be largely false. That's not to reflect on Darwin, but I do think it reflects on people who nowadays teach his theory as though it were an established fact.
Though Darwinian evolution is being attacked on many scientific fronts, we will look at 3 major areas where it falls short. First, there is the fossil record.
You can take examples of ancient creatures, apes that once walked the earth, and you can take an example of a human being, fossils from a human being, and you can look at those two side by side, and I'll say, where is the evidence that one became the other? There is no evidence. What we see is 2 different, similar maybe in some ways, fossils that represent 2 different kinds of animals.
Did life arise, as evolutionists say, gradually? Or did it arise abruptly? If you look at the fossil record, you will see that organisms appear abruptly without transitional forms, and these are found in the oldest rocks from the Cambrian period. They suddenly appear in the fossils in what is called the Cambrian explosion. There is no progression. Ann Coulter is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Godless. 1/3 of her book is devoted to exposing Darwinism.
What Darwin expected to find was all sorts of interlocking fossils. Slowly, you have the mutation, the bloody battle for survival, and a new species arises from that. The fossil record looked nothing like that when Darwin promoted his theory. But he said, just keep looking, keep digging. I'm sure the evidence will turn up. To the contrary, the evidence has come in showing quite the opposite, and the Cambrian explosion is a big part of that. We have all animal phyla right there appearing in the blink of an eye during the Cambrian explosion.
But what about the prehistoric ape men we see in the museums and textbooks that are supposedly based on the fossil evidence? Dr. Ken Poppy, author of the new book, Reclaiming Science from Darwinism, is a 30-year veteran of teaching science in public schools in Colorado.
What Darwinists are awful good at is taking like a single jawbone and constructing an entire creature. In one case, one of the famous mistakes of science, the Nebraska man, they dug up a pig's tooth and took that tooth that they suddenly assumed was of a prehistoric human, and they built an entire race of people. Pictures that appeared in London newspapers showing them walking in a prehistoric setting. And later, they finally gave the tooth to somebody who knew their dental work, and they realized it was a pig's tooth, and the whole thing collapsed.
For a while, Darwinists explained that there were no preceding, the transitional fossils, preceding that because their evidence failed to fossilize. He started to detect a pattern in their miracles. Oops, the evidence that would support our theory just isn't there, it didn't fossilize.
The second area in which Darwinism crumbles is in its attempt to blur the important distinction between microevolution, small changes within species, and macroevolution, one major kind evolving into a completely new kind of creature.
The evidence for microevolution is abundant. We see minor changes within species everywhere we look. The evidence for macroevolution is missing. The interesting thing here is that before Darwin, microevolution wasn't called evolution at all. It's just minor changes within existing species. Darwin didn't call his book How Existing Species Change Over Time. He called his book The Origin of Species. And for that, there's just about no good evidence at all.
But evolutionists take evidence for microevolution, which can be found in abundance, and use it as proof of macroevolution, for which there is virtually no evidence.
What Darwin proposed was that any creature, given enough time and different circumstances, would grow into another creature. That's macroevolution. Never been any evidence for it. Microevolution is nothing more than just variation within the species.
The third area in which Darwinian evolution fails is in explaining the enormous complexity of biological structures, even at the microscopic level. No evolutionist has been able to propose a plausible way such structures could have arisen randomly. In other words, random chance alone could not have created life. Even some evolutionists hold the view that God created life through the mechanism of evolution. One such evolutionist is Dr. Francis Collins, director of the Human Genome Project and the author of the new book, The Language of God. He believes that purely random forces alone could not have created the human body in all of its complexity.
Man is a special creature. We are not just part of some random evolutionary process with no purpose. People have compared the Human Genome Project to splitting the atom or going to the moon, and I don't think that is an extreme view. This is our own instruction book. If you printed out the sequence of the human genome on regular paper with regular font size, and you stapled it all together and piled it up, it would be as tall as the Washington Monument. And you have that information inside each cell of your body. How did this all happen anyway? I'm a scientist, I'm a physician, I'm a believer in God. Science is about investigating the natural world. Science does not answer questions like, why are we all here? Is there a God? What happens after we die? How did the universe begin? Those are questions which can really only be answered from a spiritual perspective. And I think this is the view of the 40% of scientists who also are believers. Nature magazine did a survey of working scientists 100 years ago, asking them, do you believe in a personal God who answers prayer? 40% answered yes. They did the same survey in the mid-1990s, expecting that number would have dropped. 40% still said yes.
Certainly before Darwin's day, most scientists had no trouble seeing design in the biological world.
Dr. Michael Behe, Lehigh professor and author of Darwin's Black Box, elaborates further on the complexity of the human body, even down to the trillions of cells that make up our bodies.
There are molecular machines which actually occur inside of cells, so they are really smaller than cells themselves. A good example of a molecular machine is the little molecular trucks which shuttle supplies from one part of a cell to another. No one has been able to fit these machines, these molecular machines, into a Darwinian framework.
This is why Dr. Behe and other scientists talk about intelligent design.
I consider myself right now to be what I call an intelligent design theorist. And that means that from what I can see in biology, a lot of systems have intelligence behind them. That they were not produced by random processes.
Can you get a dictionary from an explosion in a printing press? Can you get a 747 from a catastrophe in an airplane parts warehouse? Can you get the works of Shakespeare from the flying pen and pages at a printing press or something like that?
We keep hearing about gaps in the theory of evolution. The whole theory is a gap. They've got nothing, nothing. We've been looking for 170 years through the fossil record or in the laboratory, mutilating, torturing fruit flies. We've never seen one species come from another in the wild, in the laboratory, looking for the fossil evidence. And to the contrary, the fossil evidence not only is what should